Oh, yeah. Welcome back, everybody. Episode two of the Manufictioners Club. Welcome back to the clubhouse, the digital campfire. We are your hosts.
Zaheen, hello.
Karl, hello, folks.
And I'm Sean, and we are continuing on with our exploration of the Iron Man armor. In episode 1, which you can always go back and listen to if you haven't already, because I think it'll give you a lot of important context for this episode. We're going to go from episode's 1 discussion of stakeholders for project management and business analysis, why stakeholders are important, who they are, what they represent. Now we're going to take the step forward from knowing who's involved, knowing who the stakeholders are. Let's define our project scope. Let's talk about what we're actually going to do. In season 1, right, this season, we're discussing the Iron Man armor. So in season 1, we talked about stakeholder Tony Stark, Ho Yinsen, excuse me, not Yo Yinsen, but Ho Yinsen, and also Obadiah Stane becoming an important stakeholder. We even looked at Wang Chu, who we're going to talk a lot more about in this episode. But we brought up Wang Chu as a potential stakeholder, and we had some agreement, some disagreement about whether or not we should include Wang Chu. And again, if you are interested in taking any umbrage with us digitally, please go to our Patreon channel, subscribe, get on the message boards. Tell us why you think Wang Chu should be a stakeholder or should not be a stakeholder. Okay. So we know Tony is the main stakeholder. We know that Ho Yinsen, vital stakeholder. Obadiah, pretty important later on. Wang Chu, again, yes or no. But with those parties in place, well, now how do we get into the situation where we have to build something? And in the context of the Iron Man armor, it's a very specific situation. What we have in our real lives, Zaheen is a project manager, business analyst, scrum master. Karl, do you do scrums?
Nah, not officially.
Okay.
I would also note I'm more of a product owner as opposed to a scrum master. Just, important distinction.
I defeated you by calling you a scrum master.
My energy has deflated. Yes, it's true. I can't believe you do this to me.
I did not give Zaheen the proper credit, and shame on me.
No offense to Scrum Masters.
Yeah,
You're very important.
And that's something else that we can, get into on the message boards.
You don't know this, but, in her backlog, she may have just slotted you towards the bottom.
That's exactly what.
And fortunately,
never to be refined.
I've got 5 more episodes this season in which to resurrect myself. So that'll be my charge as we go through the rest of this. So let's set that context for Iron Man. And as we discussed in episode 1, and as those of you who are comic book heads are going to be quick to point out, we really have 2 different contexts for Iron Man. Again, very similar, almost exactly the same, but with some distinctions that are very important in helping determine our project and how we proceed. So we start with the inciting action, so to speak, which is Tales of Suspense, number 39, published in 1963, which it might surprise some of you who aren't comic book fans that as important a character as Iron Man is now, he did not actually start out in a comic book called Iron Man. This was a very common practice back then that new characters, before they were established and proven to be popular, they sort of got introduced in these anthology series types of things. So that's where we start with Iron Man. And the original concept that Stan Lee, you may also know him as Stanley Lieber before he anglicized his name. His concept was kind of a Howard Hughes sort of character. And what I mean by that is industrialist, rakish playboy kind of guy who's also extremely bright, probably the smartest person in any room that he goes into. And wanted to put him in a certain kind of jeopardy, to say, this guy who has everything, He's got the smarts. He's got the company. He's got the money. He's got the women. You know, anything he wants, it's at his fingertips. Let me put him in jeopardy. Let me put him in peril and see what we can explore with that character. So in Tales of Suspense, number 39, as we discussed in episode 1, 12 cents at the time.
Cheap, but also maybe expensive depending on inflation. We just don't know.
Yeah, and we'll dig into that on a fact check on our Patreon channel. So Tony, in the introduction, his parents have passed away. He's the CEO, although I don't know if they actually used the term CEO back in 1963, but he's the guy running Stark Industries, taking it over from his father, and he's working with the U.S. military, who as early as I think 1952 were involved in Vietnam, but by 1963 heavily involved. Not as deeply as they would get involved, but Tony's working with the U.S. military, helping develop technology for the advancement of the war effort in Vietnam. And that's an important note, is that in 1963, it's Vietnam. When we talk about Iron Man, the movie in 2008, it's Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And what's obviously the thing that joins both those things together?
War.
American imperialism.
And also important for the context of developing our scope in this particular instance, it's a war of unnecessary aggression that, maybe not well understood at the time, but in retrospect is, not something that the plurality of Americans would have endorsed, looking backward. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important context. And Karl, I'm going to ask you what you think, and Zine, I want to know what you think as well. Mm-hmm. I think that's important context because if you're taking a wealthy industrialist, icon like Tony Stark is in the books and in the movie at the time that we're introduced to him, putting that person in a war zone, first of all, seems grossly unnecessary on its own, yep. But even more unnecessary in wars of adventure, so to speak, such as American involvement in Vietnam in the early 60s, mm-hmm. and American involvement in Afghanistan toward the later part of the 2000s. Mm-hmm. Karl, speak your truth.
So this is all fascinating too, because I didn't know about the origin with Tony Stark with the Vietnam War, right? So when I had been introduced to Tony Stark, knew he was rich, Iron Man, and then when I saw the movie, yes, definitely the Afghanistan connection, but I didn't know about the Vietnam one. So that's interesting to see the parallels and the differences. And so I wonder, so I think from a setting of the problem, it's interesting, right? Because in the way I see it, there's two problems being solved here, right? So the first one is, yes, like Tony Stark in both situations has to get out, right? But then, so that's the more pressing one, right? That's the physical one, that's the visceral one. But I also think there's that second, deeper layer one that could be at play for like machinations down the road, right? Which is like, oh, I'm here. If I can escape, great. But I'm in this conflict that other people are in who are not so lucky. So what am I doing here, right? So for
those of you listening at home, I just touched my nose and pointed at Karl because he hit it on the nose.
Right? Like, I'm interested by that, right? Just because if you had placed him in any other conflict where, like, you had general, like, public approval, then, of course, he still wants to escape. But I'm just thinking for motivations and stuff down the road, it'd be a different tale.
Are you referring to, like, American public motivate, like,
yes.
Justifying his actions?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, because I think that was, especially the note of, in the 60s, it was Vietnam. In 2008, it was Afghanistan. I think it speaks to not just Marvel, but media and content in general being not quite propaganda, but kind of propaganda for the wars, for the actions that governments like to do. So, for instance, here we see this from the perspective of, okay, yeah, Tony is what all of us want to be. We all want to be rich and brilliant and infinitely capable of everything we want. But oh no, the bad guys took him in. How is he going to get out? So I think, in that context, it sort of makes a lot of sense to sort of define him as the hero and make him sympathetic and have him be like, how can I get people on board with me, right? I think that sort of makes sense to those sort of motivations. Yeah, I think that's what I think. Those are my thoughts.
Thus spoke Zaheen.
Yeah.
Okay, so outside of the location, there are a lot of other factors involved. So I think we want to start talking about, again, aside from location, what are those other things that affect how Tony in those two locations, Vietnam and Afghanistan, how would he go about figuring out what he needs to do? And we will also, for those of you anticipating the conversation, episode 3 is going to be all about requirements. Like, what are the requirements Tony needs to satisfy to put this armor together? What is he trying to accomplish?
Well, question for you.
Yes.
To even before that, right? Like you mentioned, his origins. There are parallels between his origin story and I think you said Tales of Suspense, right? Was that it? Right? And then the movie. So him getting injured, is that the same in both of them or is it different?
Ooh, good question.
That's more of that foreshadowing that you're really, really good at, Karl. So hold that thought. We're
Creepy music. Ooh.
we are definitely gonna dig into the ways that Tony gets injured and how they affect the context and the way you go about defining your project scope.
Bingo.
So that does tie into what I was introducing, though. That what are those other factors? So there's the how does the problem arise? How does Tony arrive in the situation? So he's in country. In the books, he's there for one reason. Again, we'll get into this in a little more detail later. But in the movies, it's for a slightly different reason. But it's because of his work with the American military, and he falls victim to an armed assault of one kind or another. Again, different, slightly different versions, and they affect how we define the problem. But ultimately, there's this inciting action that Tony gets hurt, and he's in this inhospitable place. He's in a country that he probably shouldn't be in. So aside from just the jungles of Vietnam or the high desert steppe of Afghanistan and the mountains, just the terrain being inhospitable, the people aren't taking very kindly to a wealthy American, like Tom Hanks and Volunteers coming off the plane, flashing his money going, "That's right, rich American." Tony's kind of exemplifying that stereotype. Yeah. So he's in an inhospitable place, terrain-wise, inhospitable place, culturally, and he's hurt, and he's got to come up with a way to survive. That's the fundamental problem that needs to be solved, sort of what you were alluding to, which is why I said good foreshadowing. Tony needs to live. So let's talk about the two different ways that he gets into that situation where he's hurt, he's in an inhospitable place, and he's got to survive. So let's pause there. Let's take a breath. For those of you at home, get a drink. Smoke them if you got them, and we'll be right back.